Alright, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast. BBOR, Black Box Online Radio. Today we're still discussing the case of Jonbenet Ramsey, and we're going to pay attention to one very particular detail, and that is the stun gun. And we really should say it's just the theory of that there was a stun gun used in the murder of Jonbenet all the way back in the 1990s. Now the biggest thing associated with this is it's coming to us from Detective Lou Stent, who I believe was the first person to suggest the possibility that a stun gun was used on Jonbenet. And this was done purely based on kind of providing an explanation for two particular marks that were found on Jonbenet's body. The stun gun I found, I would say that when they first talked about this back in the 1990s, I was just, I assumed that it was kind of like an established fact, or at the very least, I accepted that this was the general consensus, that this was something that was widely accepted, but it is not. And I was just like, why on earth are people throwing around theories that Burke Ramsey, the brother, was the murderer of Jonbenet? It's like, a stun gun was used on her. How on earth would he have gotten access to that at 9 years old? And, also the parents, John and Patsy Ramsey, it seemed very, very obvious that no one had any reports of them owning a stun gun, and you would use that on your own kid, and then accidental death, and this, that, and the other, and it's like, none of that made any logical sense, and, it was just a giant quagmire. It was just like confusion galore. But, of course, as we get more into true crime, and we explore more of the reports and the theories, you really know that that's not an established fact. That was just this one detective, this one investigator, was providing an explanation about how Jonbenet got two particular marks on her body. And they did a CBS documentary that was really trying to pinpoint Burke Ramsey as the exact suspect, as sort of the prime suspect, I should say. They really want to explore the Burke Ramsey murder theory. And I've talked about the Burke Ramsey murder theory on this channel, so we don't have to rehash all of those things. But that theory is completely contingent upon no stun gun. There was no stun gun used on Jonbenet, and they actually tested out. They use a stun gun on a man, and they compare his marks to Jonbenet's marks. And they have two big kind of assertions, I guess is the word we would want to say. The first is that the marks that are left from a stun gun look nothing like the things that Jonbenet have, and I believe the detective came to the conclusion that a stun gun was used on her because there are two small circular-looking marks, almost like needle pricks or pinpoints that would have that were found on Jonbenet's body, and it was theorized that a stun gun had been used on her. But when they test out a stun gun on a live human being, the marks like that are completely different. They're just like large pink patches. They are very, very definitive, and they look nothing alike. However, I would say that the absolute largest flaw with their test was they didn't show us what the stun gun marks would look like after an hour, after 2 hours. Do the markings change? Moreover, Jonbenet was found post-mortem. She was found dead. Would there be anything associated with that would affect the shape of the marks? They're showing us what stun gun marks look like seconds after it happens. But no one saw Jonbenet seconds after it happened. So I would say that there's still this giant point of contention, and I don't think that they definitively proved anything. They just want to be like, this is what a stun gun looks like 5 seconds after it's put into action. These are what the marks on a human body looks like 5 seconds after a stun gun has been used on someone. Jonbenet was found hours after she died. So, do we have some way to compare those two things? Other than that, I'd just say it's just a kind of a giant red flag and, not very convincing. But the second thing that they did put forward is a little bit more convincing. Lou Stent, who put forward the theory that this was a stun gun, he said that if they were to use that on Jonbenet, instantly she would have been passed out. And this is something, again, that I thought was kind of an established fact. And when you have the word like stun gun, like, all my life, I really thought that stun guns were meant to knock a person unconscious, but this CBS documentary is sort of like trying to, once again, assert that when you use them on a person, it's really mostly just meant to subdue them, to shock them, so you can kind of like evade them, to get away from them. It doesn't necessarily make a person unconscious. And they put forth maybe a more convincing thing that there was no stun gun used. They say that if they had used a stun gun on Jonbenet, she would have let out a scream so loud the entire house would have woken up. And that's, again, not 100% certain, but they were just like, stun guns aren't necessarily going to make someone go completely unconscious. And, once again, they did their test on a grown man versus a 6-year-old girl who was like already asleep. I mean, it's just like, there's a bit of a kind of, what's the word, tainted variable in that, using the stun gun on a grown man versus a 6-year-old girl. But of course you can't just test out a stun gun on a child. It's some kind of things that we do need to think about, though. And I'm not going to lie, even though there are certain things that I would take exception with to their tests, it is possible that everything they're saying is completely correct. It's like, because it doesn't sound beyond belief that, if they had used a stun gun on Jonbenet, there would be different marks on the body. And secondly, even if it did knock her unconscious, before unconsciousness, she would have let out a gaping scream that would have woken up the entire house. Well, then what are the marks on her body, if no stun gun? Well, this ties back to another piece of the Burke Ramsey murder theory. In the interview with Dr. Phil said it out very clearly, and I know you're probably just going to be probably shaking your head at just the sound of his name, but, I mean, he did bring this up when he's just like, some people think that was not a stun gun. Those little pinprick marks on Jonbenet's body, they think that Burke had a sort of toy train set, and a piece of the train track was used to strike Jonbenet. That, an argument ensued, he grabbed something, it's just, his toy train track, and he hit her with it. And this is all contingent upon the Burke Ramsey murder theory, that particular detail. What they believe for that one is that Burke was eating pineapple, and Jonbenet came into the kitchen and reached into his bowl and took some pineapple with her bare hands, and, it set Burke off, and, he snapped, he lost it, they got into an argument, he pokes her with the toy train track, the argument keeps going, she starts getting mad, maybe she's crying, so he hits her over the head with a blunt object, most likely a flashlight, but it could have been any other blunt object. Well, that's a theory that's been put forward. I mean, I've said from the very beginning, in the absolute very first upload, I was like, the Burke Ramsey murder theory answers all the questions. It answers why the parents would stage the scene. It answers why Patsy's handwriting is so similar to the ransom note. It answers why there are sort of these irregularities in their stories. It answers who they would protect, who they would cover up for. But on the other hand, a very big thing to say about that is, Jonbenet was found to have pineapple in the small intestine. And some people think that if she had gotten into an argument with Burke over stealing his pineapple, and then even if this is like 10 minutes afterward, there would have been no pineapple found in the small intestine. Digestion had already started, right? So it would have been found in the stomach. They were like, this had to have happened hours later. Is it possible just that, one big thing I've thought about the pineapple is Burke could have been eating pineapple, and he just left the bowl on the, what was it, like, I forget if it was a kitchen counter or the island, like one of those island counters or the table, but Burke left the pineapple out, and Jonbenet just came over and ate some of it herself, like not stealing it from him and causing this giant argument, and then that would support something more likely of an intruder theory, somebody breaking into the house and then somebody would attack Jonbenet. One of the biggest challenges to the Burke-Ramsey murder theory is that we have this thing associated with the ransom note, the garrote. Why on earth would the parents do that? Why on earth would any parent go along with that? Wouldn't it have been so much simpler just to say, oh, our daughter hit her head on something. Oh, she jumped off the table and she hit her head on something. She jumped off the bathtub and she hit her head on the toilet. Who knows? But, what would be the motivation for the parents to write this fake ransom note and to put a garrote around your own child on Christmas Day? Or I guess we're now at, 4 a.m. December 26th, but I just don't think that makes a whole lot of logical sense. And I know that people are going to be behaving differently in times of distress, and I know that it's not necessarily likely that everybody's going to behave in the same way, but in times of panic, I just can't comprehend a single ounce of motivation. I know that they would be trying to cover something up, whether it was Patsy Ramsey, John Ramsey, Burke Ramsey, no matter who would have gone for something like that. I know that they would be trying to cover up something like that. But one of the biggest things that just stands out is it would have been so much simpler to just say, oh, our daughter hit her head on something. I mean, as opposed to tying a garrote around her neck and writing a giant ransom note. And also, one of the biggest things that people do mention about the ransom note is that it was written by someone who was, they believe, was relatively calm at the time. And if this is Patsy Ramsey trying to cover up a murder, then there's probably should be a little bit more distress in the writing. That's all ambiguous, though. Back to the stun gun. I would say that a lot of investigators have really put forth a lot of things, though, that really push people away from the stun gun. And, it's just once again, back in the 90s, when this came out, maybe 1999 or something, and I saw my first ever documentary on Jonbenet, I was just I thought that this was an established fact, and, that they were using a stun gun on her. But it's not. And they've actually really raised the big question of, was there a stun gun used at all? And to be honest, that whole notion of this would have caused her to scream, even if it would have made a 6-year-old child pass out, before she would have passed out, she would have let out that kind of gaping scream that would have been heard throughout the whole house. I'm not gonna lie, that sounds somewhat plausible. Not definitive certainty, but that sounds somewhat plausible. And I mean, you're getting electrocuted, or you're getting shocked with energy, and that's what people do when they get shocked. And we almost can say with certain, I would say they provided a very good explanation, though, that Jonbenet would have had to have been unconscious when someone was tying up her hands, and when someone was putting the garrote around her, she had to have been unconscious. I think that really makes a lot of sense, just for the notion that there is such a lack of a struggle in the markings that are found on her body. It really does suggest that she was unconscious at that time, which could have caused, from that 8.5-inch crack in her skull that after someone had hit her with a blunt object. Well, that's just kind of some things I would like to present about the possibility that there was no stun gun used on Jonbenet. And also, we mentioned a couple other things in this one, that perhaps the Burke-Ramsey murder theory is kind of off in their timeline. And the other possibility is the likelihood that the Ramseys would stage the scene, that they would try and present this as a kidnapping or a murder scene, as opposed to just calling 911 and saying their daughter had an accident. I mean, it starts to get really complicated once the parents get involved into this. If you have anything to say at all, please drop a comment below. Let's expand the discussion. Let's keep talking, and maybe we can sort through some things. If you want to challenge anything that I've put out, go for it. You can hit the like button. You can subscribe. You can do any of that. But most importantly, let's talk a little more about this case. Until next time.